They say kings build legacies, but Henry built a throne of oak and gold and a coffin beside it, one for power, one for death, and the boy was made to sit between them, a crown above his brow and a silence beneath his feet. The air in the chamber never moved. It pressed against the skin like damp wool too heavy to breathe, too silent to pray. The tapestries showed dragons and saints, but the walls remembered screams. Behind the throne, there were carvings of angels. Beneath it, a hollow floor. Edward was born from blood and ghostlight. His mother died before she could name him, and before he could cry, Henry had already chosen his name, his kingdom, his tomb. The child was not a son. He was an answer, a prophecy, a sacrifice, the golden heir to a cursed throne. They dressed him in velvet, stitched with pearls, but the eyes that watched him never saw a boy. They saw property. They saw the end of uncertainty, wrapped in royal linen. He played with toy swords in a nursery where his mother once bled. He laughed under windows that never opened. And somewhere in the corner of the great hall, always half hidden by shadow, sat a wooden box, polished, locked, waiting, commissioned by the same hands that crowned him, crafted from the same tree as the throne. It was said to be ceremonial, but no one ever asked why it was his size. Henry ruled with fists and fire, but when he looked at his son, he saw a candle already burning out. So he gave him everything, except time. This is not the story of a boy who lived. This is the story of a boy who was never allowed to be anything but a legacy. And in Tudor England, legacies are measured in ash. He was born to a dead woman's silence before he ever saw the sky. Edward VI was cradled by absence, fed by ghosts, wrapped in linen not stitched by love, but by the trembling hands of fearful servants who knew what it meant to fail a king. Jane Seymour's body had not yet cooled when the wet nurses were summoned. The candles around her bed still dripped wax onto blood-stained floors. Henry stood in the doorway, not as a grieving husband, but as a man who had finally unlocked heaven's vault. The child in the crib was not Edward, he was England, a thin cry in a stone chamber, and the realm exhaled for the first time in years. But behind that sigh was rot. A court that bowed with smiles but clenched daggers in secret. A father who held his son not like a man, but like a god, terrified of being forgotten. They built him a cradle carved with Tudor roses and painted with gold, but no one dared to rock it. The slightest sway might unbalance the kingdom. He was raised in rooms colder than cathedrals, surrounded by books no child should read, instructed by men who whispered Latin at dawn and treason after dusk. His tutors smiled, but watched his breath like midwives. Every cough was a prophecy, every pale cheek a political omen. His footsteps were measured, recorded, archived. Every plate he touched was tested, every goblet held against the candle to catch the shimmer of poison. He could not sleep alone, but he was always alone, in the shadow of his father's obsessions. He was a creature of preparation, a thing that must become great before it could become real. Henry did not love Edward. He worshipped him. And what kings worship, they also destroy. Because worship is not warmth, it is fear dressed as devotion, and Henry feared nothing more than death except the idea that his son might not outlast him. So he buried his tenderness and built Edward a world of iron. The boy never touched soil. He was not allowed near dogs or rain or crowds. The air around him was strained through silk, the noise of common life muffled by layers of etiquette. He lived in a palace, but never walked down a hallway without someone counting his steps. They fed him like a relic, bathed him like a relic, clothed him like an idol. He became less boy than blueprint, a living document of Tudor desperation, and the court obeyed. Not because they believed in him, but because they feared the man who made him. Henry watched his son with a priest's paranoia. He scrutinized the boy's handwriting, his posture, his dreams. When Edward showed too much kindness, Henry called him weak. When he asked about his mother, Henry walked out of the room. Every emotion was a threat, every desire a deviation. The boy learned to smile without moving his eyes. He learned to speak with phrases that meant nothing but sounded holy. His soul was bent like a bowstring tense, beautiful, and one slip away from snapping. The throne room was his playroom, and even there, he was not safe, behind the red velvet and heraldic beasts. The walls held secrets, courtiers who swore loyalty while sharpening knives, sisters who wept in private but smiled in public, a stepmother who kissed his forehead and then burned letters in the fireplace at midnight. His world was a mirror hall of false love, and he walked it with shoes too tight and robes too heavy. Outside, the people waited for a prince to become a king. Inside, a child prayed for silence. The servants knew. They were the only ones who saw him shiver. They wiped his brow when he woke screaming. They replaced the chamber pots when his coughs turned bloody. They heard the scratching of his quill at night, writing letters no one would read. In the chapel, he sat still as stone, surrounded by men in jewels who pretended to kneel. They whispered of alliances and heirs and threats from Rome. But Edward only stared at the candles, watching them melt into the same shapes as his thoughts long, slow, vanishing. When he smiled, it was out of habit. When he stood, it was because someone whispered his name. The boy had no weight of his own. He moved like a ghost imitating a prince. And still Henry added more rules, more robes, more sermons. The king summoned craftsmen to build Edward's chair, not a boy's seat, but a throne carved with lions and thistles, as if stone could make up for flesh. On the opposite side of the chamber, a second structure was built in silence, smaller, darker, hidden behind curtains. No one asked, no one spoke, but they all knew. The boy was never expected to rule long. He was to be the sun that rose but never warmed. Henry had seen to it, given him a kingdom, but no peace. Given him a name, but no mother. Given him a path, but filled it with ghosts. In portraits, Edward appears noble, firm, precocious. But paintings are lies in oil. They do not show the weight of breath or the pressure of expectations. They do not show how often he clutched his stomach in pain. They do not show the bruises beneath the lace. They do not show how the boy flinched when touched. His life was a candle guarded from wind by cold hands that crushed the wick. The more they protected him, the smaller he became, until he was nothing but a vessel, trembling with inherited fear, and around him the court danced. Every smile was a mask, every compliment a calculation. The boy knew. He saw how they looked at each other, how they looked at him, not as a child, but as a door to power, to favor, to survival. And Henry's shadow fell over it all. Even in his absence, the king's will was carved into the marble floors. Even in his sleep, Edward was being shaped, not to live, but to obey, not to thrive, but to endure. And what does a boy become when endurance is his only language? He becomes silence. He becomes sickness. He becomes a mirror of the kingdom that made him beautiful from afar. Rotten underneath. There were days when he asked for fresh air, and they brought him incense. When he asked for stories, they gave him scriptures. When he asked for his mother's name, they gave him titles. Everything was a substitution. Nothing was whole. He began to fade, and no one noticed. Or perhaps they noticed. But it suited them. A child king is easier to manage when he does not resist. And Edward, ever obedient, learned to disappear while still smiling. He became what they wanted until he could not breathe beneath it. The air around him thickened. The light bent strangely around his bed. And still the throne gleamed, polished daily, untouched. And beside it, the coffin remained, covered in cloth. carved from the same wood, waiting, always waiting. The throne was not his. It was theirs. Every hand that bowed before it was stained with ink or blood, and behind every whisper of your majesty was the rattle of ambition sharpening its blade. Edward sat in a chamber carved for kings, but around him circled vultures dressed as guardians. They fed him scriptures and poison with equal grace. They smiled at his pallor and spoke of God's will. The boy did not see the strings, but he felt the pull. Something inside him, once soft, began to harden not into power, but into caution. The world around him spoke in riddles, and he learned that questions were dangerous. So he stayed silent, and they filled his silence with doctrine. Behind his thin frame stood men who did not kneel to the throne, but leaned on it like scaffolding. The Lord Protector, Duke of Somerset, moved through the palace like a priest wrapped in steel. He called Edward son of England and prayed loudly at his side. But his prayers bled coin. His sermons were laws. He held the boy in public, but in private he wrote edicts with the ink of famine. And when rebellion sparked, it was not Somerset's name that bore the blame, but Edward's, the boy king, still learning to read, signed deaths into parchment. They told him it was justice. They told him it was mercy. But the smell of burnt flesh drifted through the corridors like incense, and the boy's eyes grew dull. He began to see things, not visions, but patterns. How a hand upon his shoulder was always followed by a loss. How those who spoke loudest of faith were the ones whose footsteps vanished first. Thomas Seymour, the king's uncle, gave him gifts, daggers, coins, secrets, and in return asked only for attention. But attention is dangerous in a world built on shadows. Seymour slipped into the Queen's chambers at night. He whispered to maids and made promises he could never keep. When Edward mentioned this, the court hushed him. But the wheel had turned. Thomas was arrested, tried, and executed. They made the boy sign the warrant. His hand trembled. The ink smeared, but no one cleaned it. They left it as proof. Power had a cost, and Edward paid in innocence. After that, he ceased asking. He ceased writing letters in his own voice. Everything became filtered, coded, distant. He became a boy made of marble. The court reshaped itself again. This time around Northumberland, a man who smiled like frost and spoke like silk-cutting skin. Northumberland did not pretend to protect Edward. He commanded him, he wrapped him in ceremony, pushed him to enforce reforms, to strip altars and shatter icons. The cathedrals moaned as statues fell, and Edward's name was carved into edicts that turned saints into rubble. He did not understand it all, but he did not resist. Resistance was for boys. He was not a boy. He was a crown with lungs, and his breath was failing. His skin turned ash-colored in winter. His cough deepened, rattling like chains in a tomb. Yet the court pressed on. As his frame shrank, the shadow of his rule expanded. The sick child became a symbol, frail but holy, weak but divine. They called him the new Josiah, the reformer king, the Protestant hope. His words were quoted, his speeches arranged like sacred text, but behind closed doors he could barely speak above a whisper. His throat burned, his back ached. He bled from his mouth in the night. Still, they dressed him in velvet and placed him before the people. They painted portraits that lied. And beneath it all, the plot thickened. Mary, his Catholic half-sister, watched from afar. Elizabeth, the quick-eyed fox of Anne Boleyn's blood, smiled from the shadows, and Northumberland moved pawns into place. He knew the boy was dying. He could smell it in the linen, hear it in the physician's lies. So he prepared a new line, a new puppet. Lady Jane Grey obedient, Protestant, easily bent. Edward signed the document, naming her his heir. not from conviction, but from confusion. They told him it was holy. They told him it was necessary, but he saw the fear in their faces. They were not preparing for his reign, they were preparing for his absence. And so the throne grew colder. The coffin, still hidden beneath velvet, was polished anew. The wood creaked when touched, as if it sighed. Edward began to sleep less. He heard things in the walls, footsteps that never arrived, prayers that ended in sobs. Once, he walked to the window and saw crows circling. They had not come for him. Not yet, but they waited, patient. Like all things in that palace, they were trained to watch. One night, he coughed until blood stained the sheets. The physicians were called. They whispered phrases like consumption, God's test, necessary suffering. No one said dying. No one dared. But the boy knew. He saw it in the way servants flinched, in the way Northumberland grew more insistent, in the way his food changed taste, as if the cook no longer cared. His body became hollow, a cage with failing bars. And still they pushed him to sign, to bless, to approve. They needed his hand, not his heart. And he gave it, because what else was he but a hand in history's script? The conspiracies webbed tighter. Courtiers aligned themselves with Jane. Gifts changed hands. Secret oaths were spoken over firelight. The kingdom wore the mask of peace, but underneath it writhed like a serpent. Edward saw it all, and yet could do nothing. His voice was fading. His limbs ached. He barely moved from bed. But every morning they opened the curtains, dressed him in gold, and whispered, "Majesty," as if saying it made it true. He became a shrine to a future that would never arrive. His skin cracked with fever. His breath came in gasps, and the throne remained untouched, the crown too heavy to lift. The coffin no longer hidden. It now sat in the adjacent chamber, dressed in silk, ready, and no one wept. Not yet. They still needed him to live a few more days, just long enough to make the lie real, to seal the line of succession, to push Lady Jane onto the stage. Edward, ever obedient, played his part, even in decay. He performed, and those who betrayed him kissed his forehead as he slept. They whispered prayers as they erased his will. He was not murdered, but he was consumed. Piece by piece, his purpose devoured his life, until all that remained was breath, and even that, borrowed. He did not die in a blaze. He faded slowly, without triumph, without ceremony. A boy king in a bed too large, breathing through lips cracked like old paint, hands trembling beneath sheets that once bore the weight of crowns. His body was brittle now, as if the throne had leached the marrow from his bones. No one knew the hour it began, only that one morning. The birds outside the palace did not sing. The windows remained closed, the air inside thick with rosemary and rot. They lit candles before the sun had even risen, as if trying to outshine death with ritual. But death was already inside the walls, not marching, but soaking, like water beneath a closed door. The servants moved slowly, their feet muffled by carpets worn smooth by years of silence. Physicians gathered, not to heal, but to witness. They watched him breathe, measured the seconds between gasps, and nodded, as if death were an agreement, as if this was how kings must leave the world dignified, still, and invisible. But Edward was not invisible. He coughed, choked, reached out with fingers so thin they seemed borrowed from a skeleton. And when he spoke, the words did not sound like English. They sounded like wind through hollow stone. He asked for his mother, or perhaps he asked for God. The nurses could not tell. They nodded anyway, placed cold cloths on his brow, whispered comfort that felt like lies. The court outside waited, boots tapping like drums. Northumberland stood at the door, pale and composed, already rehearsing the next act. Edward had become irrelevant the moment he named Jane. Now he was a memory that refused to vanish. His skin took on the color of ivory soaked in smoke. His eyes no longer blinked at light. He stared at the ceiling, watching something no one else could see. Perhaps the weight of the crown hovering above him, still untouched. Perhaps the coffin, now only one wall away. The priest entered, mumbled Latin that failed to echo. The sound died before reaching the boy's ears. His lips moved, forming verses he could no longer finish. Scripture became breath, breath became silence, and then nothing. Not a wail, not a scream, just the sound of cloth being pulled tight over his face, just the slow click of a latch closing. They dressed him in crimson, placed rings on fingers that barely curled. The room smelled of rosewater and sweat. Outside, the sky dimmed, not from storm, but from indifference. The boy who had been king was now only a symbol, and soon, not even that. They carried his body down a hall lined with paintings of ancestors who had died in war, in exile, in fire. But he had died in linen, beneath velvet, surrounded by the careful hands of those who had orchestrated every breath. He had been a king in title, a prisoner in practice, and now, a relic. They buried him beside Jane, the mother he never knew. The tomb was grand, carved in alabaster, gilded in sorrow. But no monument could hold the truth that Edward VI, child of promise, heir of terror, had been written into history not as a sovereign, but as an instrument. And instruments, once broken, are replaced. Northumberland moved quickly. Lady Jane was crowned. The court shifted, bowed, cheered. But beneath the surface, cracks had formed. Mary gathered her allies. Elizabeth watched in silence. The throne Edward had vacated still bore his scent. His ghost had not left, and his legacy, if it could be called that, was one of fracture. England did not remember him as a tyrant or a savior. It barely remembered him at all. A flicker between giants, a breath between storms. But those who had stood in his chambers at night, who had heard his shallow wheezing, who had watched the veins rise against his skin like ink beneath parchment, those few remembered. They spoke in low tones of the boy who coughed blood into embroidered cloths, of the way he clutched his stomach and apologized for the inconvenience, of how he wrote his last words not in declarations, but in fragments. His journal, if it was his contained lines that read more like shadows than sentences. God speaks louder in the silence. He had written, but I no longer know what he says. These words were never shown to the people. They would have shattered the image of the reforming king. Instead, they carved into marble the image of a ruler who died noble, pious, and serene. A lie with polished edges. And the lie held for a time, but history is a restless thing. It scratches beneath paint, it seeps into wood, and the throne, though occupied by new bodies, still bore the scars of the boy who was forced to hold it. Mary would claim it with fire, Elizabeth with cunning, and both would rewrite what Edward had tried to shape. His policies were undone, his prayers forgotten, his memory folded beneath layers of royal dust. But something remained. In the North Tower, it is said, the wind sometimes whispers not in moan or whistle, but in words. Thin, fractured, broken things, as if the air itself remembers the breath he could not hold. They say the roses near his tomb bloom late and never fully open, as if mourning something unfinished. A reign cut short, a life never begun, a throne built not to raise, but to bury, and a coffin carved long before the need for it arrived, that waited with the patience of prophecy. Edward did not fail. He was failed by a father who mistook legacy for love, by advisers who saw a crown before they saw a child, by a world that demanded gods and instead made corpses. In the end, he was not the candle, he was the wick, and once burned, the room grew darker than before. That is the legacy of Henry's heir. Not in laws, not in reforms, but in silence, a silence so vast, even time avoids it. They sealed the tomb without ceremony. No final hymn, no thunder cracking the sky, just the shuffle of boots on cold stone and the quiet closing of a door that would never open again. And yet, in that stillness, something remained. Not a soul, not a ghost, just the shape of absence. A throne built too high for a boy's feet to touch the floor. A crown still gleaming, untouched by sweat. A lineage that was meant to roar, now reduced to a cough in the dark. Edward VI was never mourned properly. Grief requires memory, and England had already begun forgetting. But the stones remember. The walls remember. Somewhere deep in the palace, beneath the floorboards polished for other kings, there is the echo of a breath that ended too soon. It is not loud, it does not beg for justice, it does not curse. It simply lingers, and in that lingering, it accuses. For what is a legacy if it was never chosen? What is power if it was never lived? Edward did not build the throne, he did not order the coffin, but they were always his. One to elevate him, one to swallow him. That was the cruel design crafted not by his will, but by hands that claimed to protect him. And so the story closes not with a triumph, not with a lesson, but with a question that still has no answer. Why build a throne for a child if you've already measured the coffin beside it?